Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is 490. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. Got a good amount of news to talk to you all about today, and also just want to let everybody know to be sure to subscribe to the show because my coworker at antiwar.com, Dave DeCamp, is returning to the show later in the week, and you won't want to miss that episode. So wherever you listen, YouTube, Rumble, Odysee, if you like the video version, subscribe there. If you're listening to a podcast, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. Liking the show, ratings and reviews are things that do help the show out. One of the best things you could do is, put the show out on your favorite social media and just give it a recommendation, say like, hey, this is a really good show or something like that. And I have noticed that helps us to drive some new viewers. So really appreciate what everybody does already to help the show out. And if you could continue to do so, it continues to make small differences. So let's get into the news today. First up here, some news on Julian Assange. Representatives Thomas Massie and James McGovern are circulating letters in the House urging their colleagues to join them in demanding that President Biden drop the charges against WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. In a letter to the fellow House members, Massie and McGovern asked them to join them in strongly encouraging the Biden administration to withdraw the U.S. extradition request currently pending against Australian publisher Julian Assange and to halt prosecutorial proceedings against him as soon as possible. Assange, who has been held in London's Belmarsh prison since April 2019, faces up 175 years in prison if extradited to the U.S. and convicted for exposing U.S. war crimes. He has been charged under the Espionage Act for publishing classified documents he received from a source, a standard journalistic practice, meaning his conviction would have grave implications for press freedom in the U.S. and around the world. And think about this. And the U.S. government could suddenly start selectively prosecuting people for revealing classified information because they do it all the time, right? But these are official leads. This is the information that they want the public to have, that they want the public to have out. So those you could always release, but any kind of actual information that exposes government malfeasance or something like that is going to have the hammer of the Espionage Act dropped on you. Now remember, if you're indicted and charged and you're in court under the Espionage Act, you cannot even go to the court and say, look, yes, I released classified information, but those videos showed very important crimes being committed by the U.S. government, and I felt that those needed to be exposed. You cannot even make that argument. It is just, did you do it? Yes, in jail essentially for life. So this is a very bad situation that Assange is in, and if he is convicted, it's a really bad situation for journalists around the world, because remember, Assange isn't an American citizen. It hasn't been in the U.S. at least in quite some time, and so this is just picking up an Australian who was in Iceland and the UK and trying to throw him in jail for publishing information about the American government. Back in April, this is returning to Dave DeCamp's article here. Back in April, 7 House Democrats led by Representative Rashida Tlaib sent a letter to Attorney General Merrick Garland calling for the Justice Department to drop its pursuit of Assange. Massie and McGovern mentioned Tlaib's letter in the letter that they are sending to President Biden. And I believe that letter is set to go out this Thursday. So if you're listening to the show Wednesday, the 25th, and you got a couple minutes, pick up the phone, call your congressman and say, hey, Massie and McGovern are circulating this letter, and it could make a difference if you put your name on it as well. So there is some growing support for Julian Assange within government, and not just in the U.S. government, the Australian government as well. I'm not sure if this is enough to overcome the amount of hostility and people who want to see him behind bars for the rest of his life, but it is a little bit encouraging. All right, now let's go on to some news about the war in Ukraine. Report details how the CIA is backing Ukraine's assassins inside of Russia. A report published by the Washington Post on Monday revealed how the CIA has supported covert Ukrainian attacks inside of Russia, including the killing of Daria Dugina, the daughter of prominent Russian philosopher Alexander Dugin. The report said the killing of Dugina was carried out by the Security Service of Ukraine, that's the SBU, and that it was one of many operations conducted inside of Russian territory involving special units the CIA helped form in the wake of the 2014 coup in Kiev that ousted former Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych. The report reads, the missions have involved elite teams of Ukrainian operatives drawing from directorates that were formed, trained, and equipped in close partnership with the CIA, according to current and former Ukrainian and U.S. officials. Since 2015, the CIA has spent tens of millions of dollars to transform Ukraine's Soviet-formed services into potent allies against Moscow, officials said. And we have talked about this training operation before. I believe this is the one that was conducted by the ground branch somewhere in the southern United States, and that had been going on up until the time of the Russian invasion. So Dave continues in his article here. The CIA support since 2015 has included advanced surveillance systems, training both inside Ukraine and the U.S., the building of a new headquarters for Ukraine's military intelligence agency, and intelligence sharing through unimaginable pre-2014 levels. Officials told the Post that the CIA maintains a significant presence in Kiev to this day. The CIA helped the SBU form a new unit known as the 5th Directorate. Recruits for that unit were trained by the CIA outside of Kiev for the purpose of forming groups capable of operating behind the front lines and working as covert groups. You wonder if Zelensky understands the potential threat that 5th Directorate could pose to him, but that's just kind of a question I have. The CIA also gave major support to Ukraine's military intelligence agency known as the GUR. We calculated that the GUR was smaller and more nimble organization where we could have more impact. A former U.S. intelligence official who worked in Ukraine told the Post, GRU was our little baby. We gave them all the equipment and training. Officials insisted that the CIA was not involved in targeted killings carried out by Ukrainian intelligence and said the focus was on bolstering the service's ability to gather intelligence on a dangerous adversary. The report said the SBU and the GRUR have been involved in dozens of assassinations against Russian officials and in Russian-controlled Ukraine, alleged Ukrainian collaborators, and Russian officials and civilians deep inside Ukraine. Daria Dugina was killed in a car bombing outside of Moscow in August of 22, but officials said her father was the real target. Despite the fact that they are civilians, Ukrainian officials justified Dugina's killing because she was a supporter of Russia's war in Ukraine, telling the Post that there was no innocent victim. One security official called her the daughter of the father of Russian propaganda. The official said the car bombing and other operations in Russia are about narrative and showing the enemies of Ukraine that punishment is imminent even for those who think they are untouchable. The report, which is based on more than 24 conversations with current and former Ukrainian, U.S., and Western intelligence and security officials, said the CIA has objected to some of Ukraine's operations, but they never withdrew support. Other assassinations inside of Russia included a blogger, a former submarine commander that was killed while jogging, and then, the military blogger there. The SBU was also behind 2 attacks on the Kerch Bridge, which connects Russia to the Crimean Peninsula. The first attack occurred in October of last year, and that was a truck bombing that killed 5 people. According to the Post, the driver of the truck who was killed in the explosion was unaware that the SBU had planted the bomb inside of his vehicle. The second attack on the Kerch Bridge involved naval drones, according to the Post, that were developed as a part of a top-secret operation involving the CIA and other Western intelligence services. A former CIA official compared the CIA compared the CIA-backed Ukrainian intelligence services to Israel's Mossad, which is known for being behind assassinations in Iran. We are seeing a birth of a set of intelligence services there like Mossad in the 1970s, the official said, adding that there are risks to NATO. If Ukraine's intelligence operations become even bolder, targeting Russians and third countries, for example, you could imagine how that might cause rifts with partners and come into serious tensions with Ukraine's broader strategic goals. And so that was really interesting article. I recommend checking out the Post article, but if you don't have the time, Dave's write-up is fantastic on the issue as well. Now, we have the Russian response to that. So Russia says it's aware of U.S. support for Ukraine's intelligence agencies, which, my guess is that nothing in the Washington Post report came as a real surprise to Russia. It really didn't come, the extent in the fact that it was admitted publicly is a little bit of a surprise, but other than that, I don't think there's any major surprises in that report for people who have been paying attention to this war. And so the Kremlin said on Tuesday that Russian intelligence agencies are aware of the support Ukrainian intelligence receives from the US and UK. The comments came into response to the Washington Post report that we just broke down. The support that Ukraine is getting includes tens of millions of dollars in funding since 2015 and the creation of a new directorate within the security service of Ukraine. The report said that another directorate was added to work with Britain's MI6 spy agency. And the Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said, "Let's not forget that we said a long time ago, our intel agencies have repeatedly pointed to the evidence that we have Ukrainian intelligence being closely supervised by the intelligence services of the United States, the United Kingdom, one might add." And he continues here, "Our intelligence agencies have long been quite well informed about this and have duly taken it into account." So, that's, I guess, kind of the response you expect from Russia. Now, two stories here that kind of broaden, into the wider European landscape aside from just the war in Ukraine. Erdogan submits Sweden's NATO bid to Turkish parliament. So this seems like the step that Sweden needed to see to get NATO membership. So the Turkish president Recep Tayyip Erdogan on Monday submitted Sweden's NATO bid to Turkey's parliament, bringing Stockholm's interests into the military alliance one step closer. I assume that this, now comes with Erdogan's backing and that the parliament is going to pass this. Turkey likely in return is going to receive a massive, be approved for a massive sale of F-16s to Turkey that they will probably use to bomb the Kurds that live and are oppressed by the Turkish state mostly, maybe carry out some operations in Syria against Americans' Kurdish allies there. And then that does leave Hungary as the one country that hasn't passed Sweden's NATO bid. But as I've been saying all along, and as I predicted with the Finland situation, Hungary didn't want to be the last country to pass it. They didn't want to be the reason that Finland wasn't allowed into NATO, but they also didn't want to pass it and unnecessarily approve Finland or Sweden's membership into NATO if any other country was going to object. And so they kind of allowed Turkey to be the lightning rod and kind of just hung around to see what was going to happen. And I would assume that in the next couple of days, Hungary will start to make moves on this as well. All right, so next up here, officials say Baltic pipeline destruction intentional. Investigation focuses on Chinese ship's anchor. So and I wrote this for the Libertarian Institute. Finnish officials say that the investigation into the Baltic Connector pipeline destruction is focused on a Chinese shipping vessel. The Swedish Prime Minister deemed the damage to the pipeline to be purposeful. On October 8th, the Baltic Connector and a nearby data cable sustained damage. The pipeline can transfer natural gas between Finland and Estonia. The pipeline started operations in 2020, Baltic Connector is Helsinki's lone link into Europe's natural gas infrastructure network. After the incident, Finland and Estonia launched an investigation into the damage. Officials reported that the damage was mechanical and significant, but not caused by explosions. When the probe was launched, officials suggested Russia was responsible, and the head of NATO vowed to hold the guilty party responsible. On Friday, Finland's National Bureau of Investigation said the Chinese ship New Polar Bear container vessel is now the focus of the inquiry. The police have established the criminal investigation that the movements of the vessel New Polar Bear flying the flag of Hong Kong coincided with the time and the place of the pipeline damage. An NBI statement explained, for this reason, the probe is now focused on the role of said vessel. Estonian officials confirmed that the New Polar Bear was the focus of the investigation. Finnish officials noted a heavy object was found near Baltic Connector. In June, the ship was sold to a Chinese shipbuilder, Hainan Zhang Shipping, and renamed from the Baltic Fulmar to the New Polar Bear. Now, right after I wrote this article, Finnish officials actually put out an update, and they said that they recovered a very large anchor on the ground, so that was the large piece of metal, and they believe that's what caused the damage. I guess what is now unclear, if this ship was dragging an anchor intentionally to cause the damage, or if it just happened out of a shipping mistake. If anybody in my audience is versed in international shipping in any way, I'd be very interested to hear, one, if this has ever happened, that ships drag anchors on accident and damage things. And then I guess, what are the standard practices? Like, would a ship of this size actually know if it was dragging a very large anchor, or maybe this ship has to drop like 3 or 4 anchors to really stop, the size of the ship from moving. And so I just have a lot of questions around that. And again, if anybody in the audience is, in any way an expert or, very familiar with worked in international shipping, I'd like to make your acquaintance. And not only that, but interesting on what happens sometimes in the South China Sea with these phone op operations and everything like that. Knowing somebody that was in international shipping could be pretty useful. So please reach out if you're into it. All right. So just a couple more pieces here. On Tuesday, the Prime Minister of Sweden updated the probe into the destruction of a data cable that linked Sweden and Estonia. The cable is located near Baltic Connector and was damaged around the same time. The cable was not as severely damaged as a pipeline. I don't even think they noticed it was damaged right away. And so I think it was more, I don't want to say cosmetic damage, but not damage that prevented the infrastructure from doing what it was intended to, although it may need repairs now. Chinese and Russian officials have denied involvement. Russian state-owned Rosneft, that's their energy company, said, "We categorically reject as groundless any suggestions that a Rosneft-operated ship may have been in any way connected with the Baltic Connector pipeline incident in the Gulf of Finland on October 8th. Finnish and Chinese diplomats have opened communication into the incident, and the Chinese Foreign Minister Mao Ning denied any Beijing involvement. All right, time to start talking about the war in Gaza now, and this is getting rough, especially some of the statements that we have coming out of the White House. All right, so first up here, Pentagon has spent significant escalation of attacks on U.S. troops over the war in Gaza. A Pentagon official told reporters on Monday that the military is preparing for a significant escalation of attacks on U.S. troops stationed in the Middle East due to President Biden's support for Israel's ongoing onslaught in Gaza. The comments came the day U.S. Central Command said his forces downed 2 drones that were fired at a U.S. base in Syria. Starting last week, there had been a series of attacks on bases housing U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria. They've been under an increased number of attacks for really the last 3 days or so at various locations, a senior Pentagon official said, who was not authorized to speak on the record, according to the Military Times. And we'll have a little bit more information on all the attacks coming up next. A group that calls itself the Islamic Resistance of Iraq claimed it launched drones at U.S. forces in Syria on Monday, but the U.S. has not attributed blame. The Pentagon officials point the finger at Iran due to Tehran's support for Shia militias that operate in Iraq and Syria, although there is no indication that Iran is directly involved. We see the prospect for much more significant escalation against U.S. forces and personnel in their near term, and let's be clear about the roads lead back to Iran. Iran-funded, Iran-armed, Iran-equipped, and trained militias and proxy forces across the region. Now, this is a point that I've made on the show a lot, so I'm just going to do it kind of quickly here. But the U.S. likes to say, oh, all these groups operate and are proxies of Iran, which all these groups are tied to Iran. They, as they said, they all do receive at least funding, training, and arms from Iranian forces. That being said, these forces do have their own independent interests, and I don't think they just act at the behest of Tehran. I think they are carrying out these attacks on U.S. forces as a response of what's happening in Gaza, regardless of how the Iranians feel about it. It's because of how they feel about it. The American occupation and the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, and I think they probably view those two things as inherently linked, and so attacking U.S. forces in Iraq and is in a lot of the way like a response to what they probably see as the same conflict as Israel bombing Gaza. So, all right. We also have separately Pentagon spokesperson Brigadier General Patrick Ryder said there was no sign Iran is ordering the attacks, but said the U.S. still blames Iran. So this is kind of what I was just explaining. We don't necessarily see that Iran has explicitly ordered them to carry out these kind of attacks. That said, by virtue of the fact that they are supported by Iran, we will ultimately hold Iran responsible. A regional escalation is expected once Israel launches its ground invasion of Gaza. The U.S. has deployed military assets in the region to, quote, deter Hezbollah, but there are other actors from joining, with the implication that the U.S. will intervene directly if they do. U.S. officials are threatening to respond to attacks in Iraq and Syria, and President Biden has previously bombed Shia militias in the two countries over similar attacks. I would expect at least some U.S. operations like that to occur in the next couple of days. But I think the real concern is we have a host of hawks in the U.S. not just calling for, but demanding at the top of their lungs with all the political capital they have that the U.S. actually go ahead and bomb Iran now. All right, so we have this from the Pentagon now saying that U.S. troops stationed in Iraq and Syria have been attacked 13 times within a week. Pentagon spokesperson Brigadier General Patrick Ryder said between October 17th and 24th, troops in Iraq came under fire 10 times while troops in Syria were attacked 3 times amidst the drones and rockets were used to target the U.S. bases. U.S. Central Command later told NBC News that 24 U.S. troops sustained injuries during the attacks. In one incident, a civilian contractor at the Al-Assad Air Base in western Iraq died of cardiac arrest during a false alarm. A group that calls itself the Islamic Resistance of Iraq has taken credit for some of the attacks, but the U.S. has not attributed blame to a specific group. The U.S. has blamed the attacks on Iranian proxy forces, referring to Shia militias that operate inside Iraq and Syria. The White House has accused Iran of actively facilitating the attacks on U.S. troops, but Ryder acknowledged on Monday that the U.S. has no evidence that Iran was directing the operations. The U.S. is expecting the attacks to escalate as Israel is ramping up airstrikes in Gaza and prepares to invade the besieged enclave. U.S. officials told CNN on Monday that there are flashing red lights flashing everywhere. The CNN report acknowledged that the Shia militias in the region are not a monolith and can act on their own. One source said that how willing the groups are to act independently is always a persistent intelligence gap for the U.S. Regardless, the U.S. is making it clear it will hold Iran responsible for any escalation, and it is warning it will respond, signaling there's a risk a U.S. Could get into a direct war with Iran in the Middle East. So, this is just so stupid, and it only gets worse. France's Marone says U.S. should lead anti-ISIS coalition to fight Hamas. So the French president, Emmanuel Macron, said was in Israel on Tuesday and said the U.S.-led anti-ISIS coalition based in Iraq and Syria should also fight Hamas. France is ready for the coalition, which is fighting in Iraq and Syria against ISIS, to also fight against Hamas. Marone did not specify what he meant by fight, but the comment suggests the French leader was proposing the coalition directly enter the war in Gaza, which would be a major escalation. Marone's office later suggested he was talking about intelligence sharing. Their international coalition against ISIS does not limit itself to operations on the ground, but is involving the training of Iraqi forces and the sharing of information between partners and the fight against terrorism funding, Marone's office said, according to Reuters. That's kind of interesting just because I assume all of that is already going on, that they're already significantly helping Israel with intelligence. So maybe that was a little bit of a walk back to try to save just a little bit of face. All right, White House says Israel will decide on Gaza's strategy. The White House National Security spokesperson John Kirby said Monday that Israel will decide on its Gaza strategy in response to media reports that said the U.S. was urging a delay in the ground invasion of Gaza. The New York Times reported that the U.S. advised delaying the ground offensive to buy time for hostage negotiations and allow more humanitarian aid to enter Gaza. The report said that the U.S. also wanted more time to deploy additional military assets to the region, as attacks on U.S. forces are expected to increase once Israel invades Gaza. Israel's Army radio reported Monday that Israel had decided to delay the invasion to allow the U.S. more forces to deploy to the region, but the report hasn't been confirmed. And so there's been a series of reports as to why the ground invasion in Gaza has not started yet. The first was that it was the weather. The second, that it was the U.S. delaying over hostages. And now we had the U.S. delaying over its force posture in the Middle East. All three kind of made sense. Logistically, the weather could get in the way, but my guess is the weather hasn't been a persistent issue over the course of several weeks, and so that's probably relieved itself if it was an issue. Number two, getting the hostages out is probably an issue. The U.S. is probably pushing that. They don't want American civilians to be killed there, particularly by Israeli forces, and so wouldn't surprise me if the Biden administration was really putting some pressure on Israel not to launch the attack until they're able to get as many Americans out as possible. And then number three also is probably the most significant, that the U.S. understands that its forces in Iraq and Syria are going to come under pretty heavy fire once this invasion gets underway. And they need to probably get the troops out of there, if you're asking me, but at the very least, put some more military assets in the Middle East to give these people, these soldiers, a chance not to just come under rampant drone fire and rocket fire by all these Shia militia groups. The Times of Israel also reported that the Israeli military is eager to launch the ground invasion of Gaza and is hoping the Israeli cabinet will soon get the order. The report said the military has told the government that it is fully prepared for the ground invasion of the Gaza Strip and believes it can achieve its goals set out for it, even at the risk of heavy casualties to his soldiers amid the ongoing attacks by Hezbollah in the north. The Israeli military is concerned that if Hamas releases more hostages, it would lead to a delay in the ground invasion. They believe that an invasion would pressure Hamas to release captives, although they could be killed in the fighting. Later on Monday, Hamas released two more hostages, two women aged 79 and 85. All right. White House says Israel continue to kill innocent civilians in Gaza. This is White House National Security spokesperson John Kirby. On Tuesday, he said that Israel will continue to hurt innocent civilians in its bombing campaign of Gaza. This is a war, it is combat, it is bloody, ugly, and it's going to be messy, and innocent civilians are going to be hurt going forward. Kirby said when asked if the U.S. thought Israel's bombardment of Gaza was disproportionate response to Hamas's attack on southern Israel. And we've already had significantly more just children alone in Gaza killed than the number of Israelis killed by the Hamas attack. I wish I could tell you something different and wish that this wasn't going to happen, but it is going to happen, and it doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it dismissible, but the U.S. is apparently going to support it, Kirby is saying here. He also reiterated the U.S. opposition to a ceasefire in Gaza, claiming it will only benefit Hamas. Both Kirby and Secretary of State Antony Blinken said they were open to the idea of a humanitarian pause to allow more aid to enter Gaza. Kirby insisted that the U.S. would continue to urge Israel to minimize civilian casualties, but Israel has only increased its bombardment in Gaza as the war has gone on. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Tuesday that airstrikes launched before the day were the hardest yet, and we'll talk more about that next. While Kirby framed the civilian casualties as a fact of modern war, Israel's bombardment has been particularly brutal as attacks have leveled entire neighborhoods. According to Gaza's Ministry of Health, after 18 days of bombing, at least 5,791 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, including 2,360 children. Kirby cast doubt on the casualty numbers coming out of the Gaza since the enclave is ruled by Hamas, but the casualty rate is believable as the Israeli side has boasted about the scope of its bombardment. In just the first 6 days of the onslaught, Israeli forces dropped 6,000 bombs on Gaza, one of the most densely populated places on earth. In comparison, the U.S. dropped 7,423 bombs on Afghanistan in 2019, the most since the U.S. started keeping the tally in 2016. So just get an idea of the scale there. And then we had Netanyahu, who says Monday's strikes on Gaza were the hardest yet. The Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu told a group of Israeli soldiers on Tuesday that the strikes Israeli launched the day before were the hardest yet. We are striking our enemies with tremendous force. Yesterday, during our attacks on Gaza, we dealt the enemy the hardest blow he has suffered in a single day. On Tuesday, the Palestinian Health Ministry said that 704 Palestinians were killed during Israeli strikes from Monday into Tuesday, the highest death toll in a 24-hour period since the start of the bombing campaign. Netanyahu claimed the strikes killed many dozens of terrorists, possibly more than that, and at this very moment, they are finding out the exact number of the damages. So think about that. He's saying that this killed a couple dozen terrorists. Well, he says many dozen. So, I'm guessing if it was hundreds, he would have said hundreds. So he's talking about, 50, 60 members of Hamas that they think were killed, right? Well, they killed 704 people. And so that ratio is like 1 to 10. I mean, we are talking the most minimal figures on actually hitting targets here. These are, it seems like widespread carpet bombing at this point. Netanyahu also signaled that Israel will soon invade Gaza, although it's unclear when the operation will begin. We are facing the next stage of the operation. It's on our way. You are a part of it. You are the part of the spearhead, Netanyahu told the soldiers. I have enormous appreciation for what you know how to do, your fighting spirit, and your willingness to save our country from these animals, and I am sure we will succeed in this. We have only one task: to crush Hamas. Crush it. We won't stop until we get it done. All right. U.S. sends military advisors to Israel, including a 3-star general. And I'm wondering what these, military officers are going to be doing. I am guessing that part of their role is going to try to be to get Israel to not kill any American captives in Gaza. Not sure how much luck they'll have with that, but I'm sure they'll also be passing intelligence, kind of figuring out what weapons that Israel needs, and then trying to pressure the United States to make sure that any of those are transferred to Israel, and just give as much, support that the U.S. can to Israel. All right, last article up here. Israel demands UN chief resign for saying a Hamas attack didn't happen in a vacuum. The Israeli ambassador to the UN has lashed out against UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres for saying that the Hamas attack on southern Israel did not occur in a vacuum. And demanded his resignation. It is important to also recognize the attacks by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum, Guterres said at a meeting of the UN Security Council. The Palestinian people have been subjected to 56 years of a suffocating occupation. They have seen their land steadily devoured by settlements and plagued by violence, their economy stifled, their people displaced, their homes demolished. Their hopes for a political solution to their plight have been vanishing. He added that the history does not mean the Hamas attack was justified. The grievances of the Palestinian people cannot justify the appalling attack by Hamas, and those appalling attacks cannot justify the collective punishment of the Palestinian people. Seems like it would be a pretty reasonable statement, but the Israeli ambassador called the comment shocking and called on Guterres to step down, saying there is no justification or point in talking to those who show compassion for the most terrible atrocities committed against civilians of Israel and the Jewish people. There are simply no words. He said other Israeli officials criticized Guterres, including Benny Gantz, who is a minister in Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's war cabinet. Gantz called on Guterres a terrorist apologist and said that absolutely nothing can justify the slaughter of innocent civilians. Meanwhile, Israeli airstrikes continue upon Gaza, where thousands of children have already been killed by the Israeli onslaught. The U.S. has been covering for Israel at the UN Security Council by voting against any or vetoing any resolutions that call for an end to the violence in Gaza. The US and Russia are expected to soon introduce competing resolutions. The Russian version will call for a complete humanitarian ceasefire, while the US will propose a vague pause to allow aid into the besieged enclave. Some aid trucks have entered Gaza, but the US agencies have said that more than 20 times that the current deliveries are needed to supply the population after over 2 weeks of relentless airstrikes. And so, as you know, we've talked about the aid currently ending Gaza is just a drop in the bucket. All right, everybody, that's the show for today. As I said, hit the subscribe button. Got a great show with Dave DeCamp coming up tomorrow, and I appreciate you all for tuning in. Be back with more shows later in the week.